Short of time, but I would ask for responses from each of the panelists. I believe you know almost everybody up on stage. We have 4 or 5 people here that are repeat performers. The one new person is in the middle. Orjan Lindroth, president of Lindroth Development Company, a Nassau-based community builder whose projects emphasize sustainable architectural patterns as a means of addressing modern ecological challenges. So welcome, Orjan. But let's start with Eric here.
Thank you very much. Just to be very brief, clearly what we want to get out of it as an organization and as a country is to look at all of the examples that have been, that were just presented, the ideas, and as Henry said earlier, is make sure that they get linked to a local concept. So I just will end with, really finding a way to link what we're doing with the Small Island Sustainability Program at the College of the Bahamas, and also challenging, not really inviting, challenging the local architects and planners to be a part of this process, and to invite them to challenge us, those of us that work in this field, to make sure that we do bring the experiences of the Bahamian context, to enrich this process.
Great, thanks, Eric. Next, Joyce Klein Rosenthal.
Do I press this?
Press, yes.
Well, just very briefly, 2 main points. I thought it was a very rich set of afternoon talks and very interesting. I loved when Professor Spiro Palalis said the main thing we can learn from looking at these experiments is that the local vernacular architecture worked best. Using the type of roofing and construction materials actually had a better thermal performance than highly engineered materials. So that was very interesting. As well, I think the speakers also reminded us of the organic growth of cities, the history of unintended consequences. And Dean Mostafavi looked at how cities grew organically originally, but then moved in the 20th century to low-density sprawl. And that question of density as the major parameter of sustainability is a very important one for many types of planners, and I think very linked today too to challenges the Bahamas faced. When I was preparing for this conference, I noted that the Bahamas is facing what the United States is facing now too, an obesity and overweight epidemic. I was very surprised to learn that 70% of Bahamians are overweight or obese. And that's, very similar to the enormous growth rate we've had in that very serious health stressor in the United States as well. So a lot of American planners have linked that overweight and obesity crisis with land development and urbanization patterns. So it's something to consider moving forward. And just thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thanks, Joyce. Orjan.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'd like to start by saying that any good land development plan is based on seeing the environment as an asset, not a liability. And I think the fundamental problem that we've done in the Bahamas, we've experienced in the Bahamas over the last 40 years, is that land development is driven by financial markets. And I think Professor Thomas talked about qualitative analysis. You cannot do a land development without qualitative analysis, and that should come first. And that, in fact, gives you the financial plan. And that's what we've done at Schooner. We didn't know what the project would look like until we studied the place, and so what we could use of the place, and so on. So in fact, this view that environmental responsibility is expensive is completely unfounded. I can demonstrate that we found more value in what we kept than what we're building and selling, which is not understood. And that's one of the problems with how we approach development. So I think that what we're trying to do here is get some ideas and directions of how to fix this, and I think we had a lot of help from the minister in doing what we did, because we broke every rule. It's not a gated community, it has beach access. We have a 40-to-1 range of house pricing, which is unheard of. We don't build on the beach, we preserve that for everybody. So in theory, this didn't work, but in fact, it's the only thing that's working. So I think that we need to understand that anything that is approved in the Bahamas should have a high environmental component attached to the planning process. And I think that we need to look at our zoning and so on, and our building codes, which have been imported from outside and don't really apply 100% to here. And I think we should also understand that the urbanization model of the Bahamas is going to be different because we have a lot of land and water and very few people. So unlike the Chinese who have to live vertically, I think, for example, in Nassau, we could look at maybe a 5-story like Paris. I mean, that type of urbanization will give us enough density. But I think this is a great start. I think that we're coming into a new era of development. The crisis has taught us that. The old model is clearly dead, and it's dead for a good reason. So that's what I have to say.
Great, thank you. Erich Mueller.
I'd like to sort of go back to the morning as well and drawing some common threads. And one that I heard in a number of talks is building from the base. In other words, getting the local population educated to the needs of the area and having their consensus as you go forth with development. I'll give you a brief example. I was involved in a project developing what at the time was the largest marine reserve in the United States, the Tortugas Ecological Reserve. The U.S. government made a huge blunder going in and putting up lines on a map and saying this is the way it's going to be. And it promptly got shot down. They came back a number of years later with a process that worked very well, which was to engage every single stakeholder, and I mean every single one. We ended up with 26 representatives on a committee that worked for over 2 years to design this marine reserve. And in the end, we had 25 people ranging from fishermen to international NGOs all coming to one agreement. And it was possible through enlightened facilitation. We had an excellent facilitator. We also took the time to bring everyone around. And I think this is going to be necessary for any kind of development plans, whether it be MPAs or whether it be zoning and whatnot in areas, to get people to come along with you, because ultimately enforcement, especially in an MPA, but it can go on with other types of planning as well, is going to come from the people. You can't pay to have things enforced all the time. You want self-enforcement. And so I kind of also want to touch on something that I don't think we've talked about here. We've all used the word sustainability. We've heard it who knows how many times today, but we really haven't quite defined it. And I think it gets defined simplistically in 2 ways. One is at what level of sustainability do you want? In other words, some people are very happy with their life in an urban town now, and they'd like it to stay at that level, whereas some of us that tend to live in the country think it's already too much. So that's the point of going back to that local community and what level of service, of quality of life did they want to sustain. And then you also have to look at the time factor, which relates back to the costs. So we've had a relatively, in the U.S., short-term look at getting cost returns, but as you take in the longer view, the concepts we've been talking about today start to make more economic sense as well.
Great, thank you. Dr. Thomas Hope.
Thank you. The thing about coming forth is that, is it 1, 2, 3, 5th, is that all the ideas that I have on paper here have already been spoken about. So I won't say much other than to probably reinforce a couple of points. I think one of the things that strikes one is the range of approaches and disciplines that have to be brought to bear on anything like this. Everything from psychology and socio-psychology to, engineering and technology. And this is true in the thinking and as well as in the implementation, that one has to think of not only the place, but the place in terms of the people that comprise that place. as well as the ecosystems, the natural ecosystems. So I think that this is something that it's a huge challenge, but it made today's discussions to me very exciting, because so many of these angles were coming out in different presentations. And I think one of the ones this afternoon from Mr. Kelly, I think actually hit this particularly on the head. Another point that struck me and has been mentioned, but just to put another angle on it, in terms of the people in the past knew that how to construct their dwellings that was most pleasing to both themselves within the context of the environment, and so we look back and realize that not only in Qatar, but the slides this morning of the wooden buildings here, to put a Bahamian angle to this, or perspective, and an EXUMA perspective, the flow of air and of light through the appropriateness of the wooden buildings, and the way in which those wooden buildings were just part of the environment and much less imposed in terms of the materials and so on. But the other thing about the Bahamas now and the Caribbean generally is that because we are developing urban problems later on, we can also benefit from the mistakes of the past urban processes. So we needn't repeat them, although we do have usually in the Caribbean, we repeat all the negative factors that we see. As long as it happened in North America or in Europe, we think it must be good and we repeat. And I think this really is a call, not only for looking back to the past for what is good and appropriate, and that's usually the most simple forms, but also to not just repeat and implant the models from outside, but this has come up in many different ways throughout today, but to be innovative, to think outside the box, but from inside the EXUMA box, the Bahamas box, the Caribbean box, and so on. So to learn from the past. And the other point in closing is the matter of sustainability, because it was referred to today by, as a matter of survival. And so I think it's important to realize that the whole concept of sustainability is itself dynamic, as the last commentator also made mention. It's dynamic, the whole concept. There's nothing static about sustainability or what. And so it's important that we don't assume that it is a thing to which we use as a goal, because that thing will be totally elusive and it'll mean something very different to the next generation than what it means to our current generation. So it's important that we think in terms of sustainability as a process, a dynamic set of factors that are really relevant to the age, to the ethical perspectives of the society and the culture involved. And I think that's how the Bahamas and the EXUMA planning can really capture so much from the global experiences that have been mentioned today, but to see within that the threads of relativity to the Caribbean and to the Bahamas. Thank you.
Well, thank you. About how you talk about how we might learn from the past without imitating the past, and how some of those ideas resonate with the Dean's call to really project forward, to understand not only the successes of how people built in the past, but how can we use our new technologies, our new understanding of the sciences, and our new desires, the community's collective desires, to project images forward that are as forward-thinking as the sustainable practices. So thank you. And our last panelist, Robert Reiss.
Thank you. certainly I've made presentation of, and in listening to the other talks today, coming back around to water supply and having a sustainable resource. Certainly, as the minister mentioned, there's an impact to the environment when infrastructure goes in, including the ancillary infrastructure that might be associated with a home or with a water supply system, such as solar panels or wind turbines. And I think it's important, particularly in the EXUMAS that we've focused on today, to make sure that we have good thoughts and good planning as we go through continued growth and development throughout the EXUMAS and the entire Bahamas. And I think that we need to recognize that, in fact, the more rural you get, you lose the economy of scale to minimize the impact to the environment when you have discrete settlements, discrete locations where each have to have their own generator or each have their own PV panels, et cetera. So it's an interesting dynamic to balance smaller population densities that I think is also something that jumps out. And also switching to wastewater treatment, I've mentioned it, but I'll say it again, there's so much emphasis on providing supply to communities, and I think it's a bit disproportionate, and the environmental impacts of wastewater treatment get left behind many times, and there's just a way to just try to figure it out along the way. And I think that there's a lot more that could be done relative to looking at the best of the best from a wastewater treatment standpoint to minimize the impact on our environment. But the other thing I think more globally that struck me about the event today is that we're evolving as a community. The government in 2004 passed the Professional Engineers Act and put in place legislation that allows for the orderly management of engineering practices within the country. A tremendous piece of legislation that helps make the great things happen that we want to have happen in our community in an organized fashion with appropriate standards associated with the professionals that are executing that type of work. And when we talk about the ideas of how we build our community, when those ideas are formalized, then whether it's engineers or contractors, they need to, in fact, subsequently implement. And when we get to that point, it's tremendous that we have such great Bahamian engineering talent, but it's also wonderful to see that the Professional Engineers Act, while engineering set aside for Bahamians, does accommodate that integration with international partners so that we truly can achieve the type of wonderful ideas that have been presented in many cases from international participants here today. So in addition to my personal thanks and thanks to my company, but really more importantly on behalf of the Bahamas side of engineers, I want to thank the Ministry of the Environment, the Trust, and Harvard University, and certainly Minister DeVoe for the opportunity to represent the Bahamian engineering community in today's forum. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Robert. Given that we're so short of time, I want to immediately throw the floor open to members of the audience to come step to the microphone, give us your comment, give us your input, ask questions, either of the panelists or really of anyone who was involved today. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Stewart. I'm a local architect, and I'd like to first of all thank you all for coming down here and for this interesting presentation. It's very nice to see the input from various professionals, design professionals around the world, from their studies abroad and what they've recommended for those locales. And so going forward, I am curious to see how this progresses. And as a Bahamian, it's very important for our architectural community here to realize the impact of what we do for a living has on the environment. As you know, the buildings, a tremendous impact on the whole ecosystem, and the built environment affects everything. And we're at the front lines of dealing with everything. As you know, when we sit down with a client at the very beginning, whether you're in the United States or in a small place like the Bahamas, you basically are left with a task of having to educate your client if they perhaps don't know everything that you know, which is why they've hired you. And one of the things that I wanted to comment on is that, going forward, we would welcome the involvement of you guys going forward with our local Institute of Bahamian Architects and the engineers here and everybody in the built environment, in the professional engineering for the built environment. I think the other point that I would like to make is that I believe Spiro, there he is. He mentioned about another rating system that you guys were working on that you found is more appropriate for other locales, and I think that that's something I'd be curious to see how that develops going forward here, because as you know, the LEED building credit system in the United States is fantastic there because you're very close to a lot of resources and building products, but here, once everything's had to be shipped in, it blows your points out of the water. And so I think that, I think that going forward, we would welcome different rating systems as they apply in the overall wider scheme of things. And one of the other comments that I would like to make is I appreciated Erich Mueller's input on, how building materials in our environment really are subject to some of the harshest of what nature has to deliver. And as a result, it actually goes back to the lead points, is that we end up having to bring in materials that are a lot more durable so that they'll last longer, so that they don't end up falling apart and having to go into the landfill, which we don't have that many acreage of landfill available. So I think that when we approach building in the Bahamas, whether it's a small cottage in EXUMA or whether it's downtown Nassau, as Orjan said, maybe we go to a 5-story dense and medium density, which is, very well be appropriate. And on that level, we're looking at some downtown redevelopment plans as a country. So there are a lot of things we are already doing here, and having the GSD involved and the National Trust, it's going to hopefully put a lot more attention on our plight here as Bahamian architects and engineers in the design profession. So we appreciate that and welcome your input, and hopefully we can be a part of it as well going forward. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention is that the client education is probably the biggest part of this. And so after we go forth with perhaps a design charrette in the future, we could then go out to the wider public with common goals determined and broadcast that. And I think that that may help because people want to know what they can do to affect change. And sometimes what happens is you're able to affect it one building at a time, and in a small community, once one person does it, then other neighbors will see it and they will try it. And I think hats off to Orjan on his development at Schooner Bay. He's obviously broken the mold of the development there, and I think that that's going to be an interesting model at the larger planning scale. And so far as what we're dealing with on smaller projects, again, it's really down to the individuals being educated to know that these systems are available to be used. And I think the government's now coming forth with plans for the duty-free importation of solar panels and things like that. And so that's really helping us move forward as a greener country. So great. I just wanted to thank you all. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you for those comments. And it's nice to hear the enthusiasm in the room that we've heard over the course of the day, the desire for individual and organizational participation in the process going forward. I think that's going to be critical. What else? Other comments, other thoughts, other questions?
Good afternoon. My name's John Kenton. Some of you may know me as the Director of Public Works, but I'd like to speak in a personal capacity, actually, as a lifelong supporter of sustainability and conservation, and express my appreciation to the organisers today, what I see as being a wonderful conference and a wonderful bringing together of many talents. I think the question I'd like to put to the panel, though, is how do you develop a natural wilderness? Because the thing that strikes me about the presentations today is that what's in the EXUMAS is unique and wonderful. And I recently, or previously, worked on development plans for the east of England, which was nothing in comparison to what you're looking at here. But even in that already highly developed environment, we were talking about environmental limits. And I had a real job working against the development powers, actually explaining that limits were limits, and that if you exceeded them, then you actually destroyed what you were attempting to protect. So I'd put that forward as one observation. That I think the other great value I got from today was an extension of that idea of environmental capacity to a much broader carrying capacity, which is the social, environmental, economic, financial, in other words, every aspect of that context. And I think there are a number of very valuable observations today, one of which was that the EXUMAS shouldn't be viewed in isolation, but we should be viewed in context of the whole of the Bahamas. And if I may say so, I think at a very crude level, the Bahamas has currently pretty well got it right, actually, because we've focused all the, if you like, bad development on New Providence, and it attracts a particular type of tourists, but it has allowed the rest of the Bahamas to remain the pristine beauty which it is. Three examples I'd like to cite of where I think pristine wildernesses have been maintained and work as tourist attractions and still develop a lot of economic value. The first is Uluru, or Ayers Rock in Central Australia, where in fact there's no development at all within, I think it's about 5 miles of those rocks, because the very essence of those rocks is their isolation. The second is the Barrier Reef, where if you want to go to the Barrier Reef, you have to take a 20-mile boat trip. And I think the third would be Antarctica, where, partly because of the environment, nobody wants to build anywhere. So the model that I'd suggest, perhaps, is that it's an extension of what we've currently got. And I'm no means talking against development. What I'm talking against is bad development that kills the goose that lays the golden egg. And my daughter was much luckier than I. She's a student studying medicine. She's had 2 opportunities to go to the EXUMAS on extended day trips, and indeed my son's done the same thing. So you can parachute people in to witness the beauty and witness that pristine wilderness. You don't necessarily have to build right on the spot. It seems to me, Great EXUMA, we do have the opportunity to bring those tourists much closer to that beauty, and Georgetown could be developed, and that's perhaps where some of the lessons of urban development could be applied to what we're doing in the Bahamas. But I'd repeat my question to the panel. You know, how do you develop a wilderness?
It's an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Here's paradise.
I would like to apologize to Mr. Reed for taking the floor a second time, but I would be remiss if I didn't apologize to Dr. Klein Rosenthal for kicking the chair in front of me when she was making a presentation on climate change. I happen to be responsible for the Bahamas Environment, Science and Technology Commission, and one of my responsibilities is the issue of climate change. And I think in terms of looking at what we are talking about, the issue of the vulnerability and the opportunities to adapt in the Bahamas have to also be considered. And I'm not quite certain if that message came out clear enough or loud enough. We are one of the most vulnerable countries globally, not in the region, globally, Dr. Hope. 80% of the Bahamas is within 1 meter of sea level. When we build and when we think of EXUMA, we have to think in terms of the entire Bahamas. So resiliency have to be built into all buildings, including public buildings, to allow for the inevitable. We will have storms. We will need to protect people, and we will need to house people in safe structures. We also have to move away from the distinction that everything is available for construction. Because what climate change teaches us is that we have to allow for a scope to retreat or to designate lands that were vulnerable and not to use them in a manner that's unsustainable. So the big elephant in the room is not only talking about sustainability in this context, but sustainability into the future. And what will survivability mean in the future if we do not now start taking into consideration the fact that we will have coral bleaching, as Erich Mueller has demonstrated in the CMRC. We will have issues dealing with water resources and water stresses. And how do we define vulnerability and sustainability into the future is unique to this particular environment. And I hope that we need to bear in mind.
I couldn't agree with you more. Sustainability and adaptation is definitely local and contextual. And it reminds me that the Dutch have a planning model based on consensus. So they would get together for months, for years, a lot of evenings, a lot of days. It takes a lot of time, but they would get together and discuss what areas, you would set aside to let the sea, move forward, and what areas would you retreat from development. And I'll be very interested to hear how Bahamanians decide, over the coming months and years, because we definitely agree that the situation is, one that needs to be considered and dealt with. Thanks. And I just wanted to answer the other question, too. How do you develop a wilderness? We had a short panel discussion. We decided you don't develop a wilderness. But I would also like to add the national parks have a model where they use a lottery system sometimes for allocating use of certain areas. And I don't know if that's something that other panelists think, and Bahamanians think could be considered just for use of different aspects of the EXUMAS, a lottery or a first come, first served basis. Thanks.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to correct, it's Bahamians. I want to thank all the panelists and everyone. I think this is actually very revolutionary. My name is Danielle Hanok Williamson from Ministry of the Environment, and I'd like to, highlight the fact of this whole process. This is very, like I said, revolutionary. In this room, you have a lot of Bahamians and also international persons who are experts in the area. And in working with, I had the opportunity of working with Mr. Martini, who tried to develop a draft master plan for EXUMA. The fault of that was it only focused on Great EXUMA, and it did not incorporate the surrounding keys. I think the challenge that we have now, which I find great hope in, is that we are looking at it as an integrated system, but not just the EXUMAs. The whole Bahamas is integrated, and that was highlighted not only in the presentations, but also your research of the examples of what happened in other parts of the world, is that we're all integrated. And so my question is, in reference to research opportunities for urban design, you try hard to find examples that are in the Caribbean region of any urban studies, specifically in reference to climate change and the heat island effects that you focused on. And I think this is a great opportunity of looking at that, at looking at how it is in the EXUMAs and also in New Providence. I'm sure you might hear people complaining how hot it is, but in New Providence it's because of various factors of how it's been developed and the lack of planning. Moving forward, I see that this is a great way of trying to get everyone involved. Now, in the Bahamas, we like to talk a lot, but we don't like to really implement. No apples are thrown at me. But basically, we like to talk, and it's a challenge of getting the right stakeholders to talk at the right time and to really identify what they really want. So in the process of working with Mr. Martini, when he did the draft plan for EXUMA, there were stakeholder meetings held, but the way it was done kind of rubbed people the wrong way. And so when we actually did go to them, they didn't really know how to share what they really wanted. So I know there is no right or wrong, but I'm sure that with the other examples of, in other countries, we could kind of take our culture and the way we are and kind of try to learn from past experiences and say, well, really break it down on a level. Because the concepts, everyone kind of gets it in this room of what sustainability is, how important the environment is, why it all matters. To the average Bahamian, they don't get it, really. They realize it's important. They kind of realize that sea level might be making a difference. There's an issue with beaches, but in the grand scheme, they don't really see how it affects them. So if we could break it down where the average person really gets it, and then they can understand, well, this is my point of view, and then really make a plan that will make a difference.
I think those comments are well spoken and kind of reinforce a couple calls we've heard this afternoon for how important it is to design the process moving forward, that the task ahead isn't simply to make design proposals and planning proposals, although in part it is, but also the task is to really figure out what is the best process or set of processes that will engage the largest set of voices and publics in this conversation moving forward. I'm afraid I do need to close the panel, though, given where we are with time. So first, I'd like to thank the panelists for your participation and comments this afternoon. It's been wonderful. And we have a series, 3 sets of closing comments. I'd like to ask the panelists to just remain in place for a few moments. The first set of closing comments will be given by Neil McKinney, President of the Bahamas National Trust. And Neil, I'll call you to the podium over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to be very brief because I know there's not a lot of time here, but one of the things that stood out to me this afternoon in the presentations, amongst many things, was when the Dean showed the picture of the house in London that was by Regent Park, and how it looked as if it were meant to be in the country. Because even today, and that was from centuries ago, even today, if you go to London on the weekend, London empties out, and the people don't go to the suburbs. They still go to the country. This weekend here is our Independence weekend. And if you tried to get a seat on one of the planes right now, you wouldn't. All the flights would be full as people go back to the islands. If Eric Carey had his way, the headquarters for the Bahamas National Trust would be in Eleuthera, I can tell you right now. But it's an interesting thing that people do connect and seem to go back to the islands. And that raises an interesting prospect, because as our population ages, as our demographics change, are more people going to leave this island and go back to the islands of their birth or of their parents? And how will that affect the sustainability of what is being done and what is being planned and all the infrastructure there? So that was something that stood out to me this afternoon, which I hadn't considered this morning. The only other real comment to make about it is so many facts and figures have been put out today that it's a little overwhelming to try to take them all in. But looking at those facts and figures, what will be important as we move forwards is how can we take those experiences from other countries and other places and then translate that into a Bahamian experience, because clearly we didn't come here to hear about how other cities grew or why they grew. That's for us to take that and to translate that into a Bahamian experience. And really it will be important that we are able to do that if we're going to make use of what is being put in front of us today. So those are my only comments. I would just like to, I'm not doing an official wrap-up, but to thank everybody who was here, thank Harvard University for all their support, thank our international speakers, Government of the Bahamas, and everybody else who attended. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Neil. And second, I'd like to invite Dean Mohsen Mustafavi to the podium.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of very brief comments. It's really amazing to me the incredible goodwill that has been in the room all day and really throughout the whole evolution of this particular project. I think this is really something that is that's really noticeable, and it's also something that's extremely inspiring. I can assure you that it's been an incredible honor for us to be here, and we are also very excited and genuinely believe in the importance and value of this project. So would like to receive your thoughts and your feedback in terms of what would be the most beneficial, productive, useful ways in which we can move forward. I do want to assure you that whenever we are engaged with a research project or a conference like this, it's impossible to try and do everything at once, in one go. We plan a sense of the totality of a range of things, and then at any one point, we're dealing with a specific set of issues. So we're not just dealing with a kind of Band-Aid solution of bits, but we are dealing with specific fragments of a larger body. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind, because it requires a certain level of patience on the part of the participants, because every different stakeholder has a different sense of the priorities. And I think we need to establish together what may be the critical steps to address those priorities. We have some idea in terms of the way we, for example, run studios at Harvard that are very speculative. That might be a very interesting model to use to collaborate with, you know, the fact that we have the minister, and then we have Orjan, and we have people who are working on the marine biology, actually being able to bring all those people together to do speculative projects, which is like, what if we could work on something, as opposed to here is a specific development by a particular developer. This is, I could imagine that being a very productive way to use the amazing knowledge that is here in the room. A lot more sort of ideas and possibilities of looking at things in more detail, but it would be very exciting to receive your feedback. I feel I would also be remiss if I didn't really, like everyone else, thank all the incredible people who've been here. I do want to thank Countess Beatrice for being so inspiring and available, and once again the Minister and Eric and Neil, and of course all the amazing people from the GSD, as well as Judy and Tom, who have really made this event possible. Thank you all very much, and thanks to all the incredible speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohsen. And finally, I'd like to bring back to the podium the Honorable Earl D. DeVoe, Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You have survived a long day. I think I achieved my objective when we conceived of the idea of having this conference. I hope you did, Eric. I hope you did, Neil. And I certainly hope you did, Countess. The idea of the conference was to try and inspire the audience to understand the need and the importance of planning, to bring contractors, architects, engineers, and planners together to take a look at the Planning and Subdivision Act, using the EXUMAS keys as an example, to illustrate the importance of
informing clients' desires and decisions with some sound planning principles in this opening seminar. And the idea was to ensure that we brought together the level of expertise and broad knowledge to inform how we go about making development decisions in our country in very fragile, sensitive ecosystems. And I very much believe that we accomplished that. We had in the room some bankers, some architects, people who approve applications for development, people who make applications for development, but more importantly, people who work with clients. And the decisions on building designs, environmental impact assessments, mitigation, access, and appropriate use and density are not things that could be mandated by a government entirely in law. It has to be a culture nurtured in a series of processes and a sense of belonging to the process. We believe this is the first of a number of such sessions that we hope to do, and it is my hope that the people who build, the people who design, will not lose sight of the importance of their role. You notice most of the academicians talk about research. They never lose sight of their role. They are in a constant pursuit for more knowledge. And whenever you get an academician in a room, you hear about the need for more research. Very important. If somebody wants to build a house and develop a subdivision or build a hotel or create a national park, they need to make decisions based on an appropriate level of understanding and knowledge at that time. So decisions will always be before us. And my role in this process is to ensure that we protect and preserve what's important to us. I want to respond just very briefly to something that resonates deeply with me. It was a question raised by Mrs. Lockhart Charles regarding the capacity of the world, as I understand it, to sustain itself going forward. And I'll just use one illustration to help inform how I approach that problem. There was a recent article in an Economist magazine roughly about a month ago, and it spoke about a plot of land in Great Britain that was the host of a research facility, the longest sustained research facility in the world, where they did research on wheat. On this particular 14-hectare tract of land, they had a range of agricultural practices that they researched. And you had yields up to 10 tons per hectare and as low as 1. And so you had all of the variables that help you determine whether the world would have food with 9 billion people or 20 billion people. And the message in the article was that if you adapt and apply knowledge in a local environment, even the African farmer who was getting the 1 ton per hectare is able to get 10 tons. Appropriate fertilizer, appropriate seed, appropriate variety, and appropriate management. And I use the word appropriate advisedly. But the point is, in making decisions about development, we must use the knowledge of the world in an appropriate way in a local environment. And nothing compels me more than food and the science of growing food. How to use irrigation, how to use fertilizer, how to use the weather, and how to manage the biology of a plant to get the yield that you want. Man has been able to do that in ways that pushes the boundaries of any thought of starvation in the world. The challenges come with distribution, pricing, marketing, and the availability of the technology. The same thing applies across the board in many other things, the same principles. So we're not looking for a one-cap-fit-all solution. What we're looking for is A population that is able to respond, that has tradable skills, and that is able to cope with the demands and the challenges of a changing world. If we can build that in our communities, in our decision makers, in our professionals, as we go forward, I think we'll achieve the objective of this kind of endeavor. I have a small gift for you, Dean, that my staff insists I share with you. We produce a book as our annual report to the nation. It's called Environmental Stewardship, and it was intended as our report to the nation. And hopefully, when we are able to get the rest of them printed, we will do what we intended to do in the first instance, get it a DVD for the College of the Bahamas and copies of the books in all the schools. But they did give me one for you, and I would like to see that you get it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for everything. Thank you.
And And before I take my seat, I'd like also to thank all of you wonderful people for coming here, and all of you who are here now and those who came this morning. It is our intent to produce the conference. It's all been recorded, and with the permission of the presenters, we will use your words and your slides and your pictures, and we will give them widely to the College of the Bahamas and to our professionals. And we are going to put you on TV in my slot. We have a broadcast station that permits us to get airtime on ZNS, our national station, and so with appropriate voiceovers, the nation will hear what we have heard going forward. So we don't intend to let this room confine the knowledge that was shared today. And we look forward to the other sessions that will come in due time. On behalf of the Prime Minister and my colleagues in government, I want to thank the Aga-Khan, the Bahamas National Trust, and the wonderful people who made this idea a reality. Thank you very much.